This is going to be a revision video for the respiratory system part of the body systems and health topic from the first and second year science course. So to cover the main points of this, the respiratory system is the system involved in breathing. So the main organs that are involved in that are the lungs. So you might already know this, but you have two lungs, one on the left and one on the right. And it's made up of certain structures. The main point is that those lungs are involved in what's called gas exchange, okay? So where you would take in oxygen and you would release carbon dioxide. Now those aren't the only two gases in the air, but they're the ones that you would want to take in from your lungs, the oxygen, and then release from your lungs as carbon dioxide. So in the course you'll need to know the structures involved in the breathing system or the respiratory system. So that's why I've got a little diagram here to show you the main structures. Now this will be very similar to the PowerPoint that you'll have seen. Maybe not exact because my drawings are not exactly a Picasso, but they're near enough. So overall this whole view is a front view of your chest. Okay, so I've got one side with a little bit more detail than the other. This side is showing the ribs. So this is as if a person has been cut right down the middle at the front. So this would show the ribs at the side. I've not drawn them on this side just to make it easier for myself. Okay, there'll be muscles in between the ribs. And then there's also a muscle underneath your lungs. And this muscle is called the diaphragm. Now that diaphragm is spelled with a silent G. Now these two structures, the rib cage and your diaphragm, are involved in breathing, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Now, when you breathe in, air will pass down initially a structure called the windpipe. So when you breathe in through your mouth and your nose, those two tubes, essentially, the one in your mouth and the ones in your nose, go into one tube at the back of your throat. And that one tube is this one here, which is called your windpipe. Some people might know this as the trachea or the trachea, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And you won't need to know the fancy terms of this. Windpipe is plenty. So that windpipe is the one that runs down the front of your throat. Now when air passes down the windpipe, it then has to go to each lung. And that's why each lung has a branch off of this windpipe. Now that branch for each lung is called a bronchus. So you'll see that this one goes to this lung and this one goes to the other. Okay, so a bronchus for one, and we call it bronchi for two, so the plural of bronchus is bronchi. Now this one bronchus goes to this lung, and the other bronchus here goes to this lung. Now this lung looks very different from the other one, and it's because I've essentially sectioned that one right down the middle as well to show what's inside that lung. Now these little tubes that are coming off the bronchus, these smaller, thinner ones, have a longer name. And these are called the bronchioles. Now you might have heard of a word similar to bronchus or bronchioles, which would be bronchitis. So if you get an infection, a throat infection that goes down into your bronchus or your bronchi, that would be called bronchitis. Now your last part, which I'm going to label here, are where that gas exchange I was talking about happens. So these are called your air sacs. Now you have millions and millions and millions of these in your lungs. I've only drawn a few, and I've drawn them far larger than what they would be in your actual lungs because they're microscopic. Okay, so your air sacs is where gas exchange takes place. Now when you breathe in, it will pass from your windpipe to your bronchus. Okay, so down this windpipe, down into your bronchus, and then down into a bronchiole next. And then it will go into your alveolus, or which a fancy name for your alveolus, which is called your air sacs. Okay? So these air sacs are the last place where that air that you breathe in will go. Now when you breathe out, it'll do the reverse. It'll go from your ear sacs, up those bronchioles, up your bronchus, and then up and out your windpipe and out through your mouth and your nose. Okay, so what you now need to know is a bit more about these ear sacs. So what I've done is I've drawn a bit more of a zoomed in version of an ear sac. So this thing here is an ear sac. Now these air sacs are the site of gas exchange. So what I mean by that is where gas is swapped between the blood and then this air sac. So the gases that are in there, the two that we talked about, are CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and then O2, which is oxygen. Now when you breathe in, the air that you breathe in contains a mix of a whole bunch of gases. Carbon dioxide, oxygen, argon, nitrogen, methane, loads and loads of things. But the main gas that you want to get from the air into your blood is that oxygen, okay? So this air sac here is surrounded by a blood vessel, more specifically a capillary. So if you remember that from the circulatory system we talked about. So that capillary has red blood cells in it which will pick up that oxygen. So when you breathe in, that air comes in and that oxygen will pass from your ear sac across and into your blood. So that oxygen is moving into your blood and then that will get taken around your body and will be given to the body cells and your body cells will use them. Now at the same time, what your blood is doing is getting rid of the carbon dioxide that's in it. Okay, so the carbon dioxide is then pushed out of the blood and then it'll be breathed out of your lungs. Okay, so when you breathe in, air is brought in and oxygen is picked up by the blood. And then when you're breathing out, again, that carbon dioxide that's released from the blood is pushed out. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to is how you breathe. So that's what's called mechanism of breathing. So when you breathe, like I said before, you have a few structures that are involved in this. So you have your rib cage, which involves your ribs, and your diaphragm, which is the muscle underneath. So breathing involves two processes. It involves breathing in and it involves breathing out. So when you breathe in, that is called inhalation. So when we inhale, you bring in air into your lungs. So inhalation is breathing in. Okay, the next one is exhalation, which is breathing out. Now if you stop for a minute and just put your hands onto your chest and you breathe in, take a big deep breath in. When you breathe in, your whole rib cage pushes out and it lifts up. And that's because your rib cage is getting bigger to pull air into your lungs. So this rib cage here moves up and it moves out. Okay, so you can breathe and feel that again. So your rib cage goes up and out. And notice how much bigger that lung is. Okay, so this is what that would show here as a lung. Now that rib cage moves up and out and it makes that lung expand. Now it's not only your rib cage that's involved in that, it's your diaphragm as well, that muscle underneath your lungs. So that diaphragm here pulls down. So when it pulls down, what it does is it makes your lung get bigger underneath as well. So your rib cage is pulling it up and out and your diaphragm is moving it down. Now what both those things do is they make that whole lung and that whole chest cavity get much, much bigger. And notice how your lung is really big there and it pulls all that air in. So air gets drawn into your chest, right down that windpipe, right down the bronchus, right down the bronchioles, and right to those air sacs. Now if you take a big deep breath in again, and then you have a big deep breath out, what you'll notice is your chest goes back down and it goes back in. So that rib cage here goes back down. Now it just doesn't go down on its own, it goes down and it goes in. And that diaphragm, to get all that air pushed out of your lungs, it squeezes up the way. So that diaphragm goes up. And when it does that, you see the comparison between the lungs. The lung gets much smaller and it forces all that air out. So it goes from your ear sac up through your bronchioles, up through your bronchus, and then up and out through your windpipe, and then that'll go up and out through your nose and your mouth. So when you inhale, your rib cage goes up and out and your diaphragm goes down. And when you exhale, when you breathe out, your diaphragm pushes up to get the air out and your rib cage pushes down and in to get that air out again. Okay, so that's what we call the mechanism of breathing, which basically just means how you breathe. Now the last part in your respiratory system notes is about peak flow. Now some of you might have tried a peak flow meter before, which is what we use to measure peak flow. Now peak flow is essentially how quickly air can be blown out the lungs. Okay, so that's when you would essentially do a really fast, sharp breath out. Now, like we've done with pulse rate, we measure pulse rate, and if a person's pulse rate is really high, that implies they're unfit, or it tells us something about their health. Peak flow does the same. So peak flow can tell us something about someone's health. So if you have a low reading, below normal for your height and your age, what that'll indicate is that you might have asthma. So anyone that might have ever been tested to see if they have asthma before will have blown into a wee tube with a wee scale on it. When you blow into that, it moves a wee marker, and if you don't blow that very hard or it doesn't come out very fast, that basically means that you might have asthma. So if you do have asthma and your doctor decides based on your peak flow meter reading that you have asthma, what they'll then suggest is to improve your asthma, they might give you an inhaler. And they might tell you to regularly exercise, because what that'll do is that'll help your breathing and help your peak flow to improve. Okay, so that covers all of your respiratory system. So we've covered the parts of the respiratory system, so all the areas in how air passes down into your air sacs, and then gas exchange within the air sacs, and then how breathing takes place in terms of inhalation and exhalation, and then peak flow and what that means. Okay, so that concludes our video on respiratory system.